It's a celebration of America's freedom. Welcome to the Marc Scaringi Show. The Marc Scaringi Show is your place for a weekly discussion on making America great again. The important political and legal issues of the day, a celebration of the Constitution, and traditional American values. Marc is a practicing attorney, a former senatorial candidate, a Donald J. Trump-endorsed delegate, and a defender of the Constitution. His goal? To put America first. And now, celebrating America's freedoms, here's attorney Marc Scaringi.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Marc Scaringi Show. This is your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. This is where we talk about the important political and legal issues of the day from the perspective of putting America first. And welcome to my listeners here on WHP 580 and iHeartRadio, and also to my viewers and listeners on Harrisburg 100 Facebook Live and the Marc Scaringi Show Facebook Live and several others. You're welcome to comment live if you'd like, or call in at 717-540-0580. That's 717-540-0580. If you'd like to listen to some prior podcasts of the show, read my biweekly columns on Penn Live, or to take a look at some great merchandise we have, you can check out the website at marcscaringishow.com. And don't forget to subscribe to our show on YouTube and follow me on Twitter at Marc Scaringi or on Facebook. We brought you last week's show from lovely Cape May, New Jersey, where the family and I were spending a few days at the beach. We had a wonderful time. The weather was beautiful. We enjoyed these balmy 80-degree days at the beach and the pool, only to come home to Harrisburg on Tuesday to 95 degrees and about 80% humidity. So it was much cooler at the beach, but we're very happy to be back here in central Pennsylvania. Well, much has been going on while we were away over the past week, and we'll do a roundup of some of the nation's biggest news stories and take your calls. And we'll talk today, if we can, about the New York Times 619 project that has generated a lot of news across the country. But before we begin, I just wanted to talk a little bit about United States Senator Elizabeth Warren. And you'll recall Senator Warren with the claim that she made about being a Cherokee Indian and the controversy that caused her campaign launch some time ago. We know that starting decades ago, when Elizabeth Warren was trying to get jobs at our extremely liberal colleges and law schools, she claimed that she was a Cherokee Indian. And back then, like today, many of our liberal institutions, they'll hire and promote based upon race and ethnicity instead of merit. So Elizabeth Warren claimed she was a Cherokee Indian. She got hired by Harvard Law School, among others. Now that she's been caught, that she's lying about it, and she's pretending now that she really never claimed to be an Indian in order to advance her career. Now, the Democratic Party and liberal media have been giving her a pass on this major lie and cultural misappropriation because, of course, they agree with her liberal policies and they want her to succeed politically. But some of the Cherokee are not giving her a pass, and apparently there was a big confab on Monday where Elizabeth Warren and several of the other Democratic presidential candidates appeared at a presidential forum on Native American issues. And Elizabeth Warren arrived to this forum to a standing ovation, and she used her appearance to try to put the controversy to rest by saying, I know I've made mistakes. I'm sorry for harm I've caused. Now, of course, she doesn't explain what she means by mistakes. What mistake do you think she's referring to? Well, the fact that she lied about being a Cherokee Indian when she was not, that apparently is, she's not going to admit to that being the mistake. So we're not quite sure what she means by this mistake that she's made. She doesn't say. But apparently she's going to try to pass that off as some sort of apology. She's trying to make amends with what she referred to as Indian country. And so at the forum, she promised full funding for housing, for health care, for education, for infrastructure. She claimed those are not optional. We need to change the rules and make it happen. So she's at this big forum for Native Americans, other presidential candidates are there. She gives this kind of half-baked apology, saying that she's made mistakes, although she doesn't admit the mistake that she made was lying that she was a Cherokee Indian when she is in fact not. And so she tries to get in the good graces of our Native American friends by promising them housing, health care, and education. So she's going to take money from the taxpayers and give it to the Indians for their housing, health care, and education. That is Elizabeth Warren's campaign platform. Now, in any event, as I said, she has been taking some heat from some Indians for her cultural misappropriation. A Cherokee Nation official said at the time that Warren released her DNA results where she was trying to prove that she was a Cherokee, this Cherokee Nation official said that using a DNA test to lay claim to any connection to the Cherokee Nation or any tribal nation, even vaguely, is inappropriate and wrong. And then also a citizen of the Cherokee Nation watched Ms. Warren's remarks at the forum earlier this week and tweeted about them. She said Warren had eroded tribal sovereignty by taking into her own hands the ability to determine who is and who is not Cherokee. He said of Ms. Warren's apology, "It's not enough for me." So there you have some critiques by some members of the Cherokee Nation of Elizabeth Warren's kind of fake apology and her cultural and ethnic misappropriation and misidentification. And it's amusing to see Warren, a liberal Democrat, trying to make amends for what she has done by offering to give Indians as much of our taxpayer dollars as possible, yet she's being slammed by some of those same Indians. Now, a real Cherokee, Elizabeth Warren is not a real Cherokee. A real Cherokee, Rebecca Nagel, she's a writer, she's an advocate, and a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. She just wrote a blistering op-ed in the left-wing publication called Slate. Now, this Cherokee woman, she worked with a Cherokee genealogist and discovered some rather disturbing things about Elizabeth Warren's ancestors, and this is relevant to what we're going to discuss later in the show, the 1619 Project, because it is about race and ethnicity. And Elizabeth Warren is obviously a white woman pretending at one point in her, for many decades in her career, to be a Cherokee Indian when she was in fact not. A real Cherokee Indian researcher, writer, and teams up with a genealogist, and they do a real analysis of Warren's genealogy. And they find out that apparently Elizabeth Warren's great-great-great-grandfather was a white man named William Marsh. He enlisted himself in a Tennessee militia unit to fight in the Cherokee War against the Cherokee. And he occupied Cherokee land in the lead up to the Trail of Tears. So, and we'll talk more about Elizabeth Warren's genealogy and then the 1619 Project when we return from this brief commercial break. You're listening to The Marc Scaringi Show.
Now, more of Marc Scaringi on News Radio WHP 580.
And welcome back to the Marc Scaringi Show, your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. We're talking today about the New York Times put out the 1619 Project, which has generated a lot of attention by the media and others across the country. But before I get to that, I'm finishing up a little update on the campaign of Elizabeth Warren, because it's tied into this whole idea of race and ethnicity that is the center point of the New York Times 1619 Project. And so we're talking about how Elizabeth Warren went to a big confab last week of Native Americans, among with other presidential candidates, and she somewhat apologized by saying she's made mistakes, although she doesn't explain that the mistake she made was lying about how she was a Cherokee Indian when in fact she was not, and how she is being slammed right now. There is a real Cherokee Indian, a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, who's a writer and an advocate, and she teamed up. Her name was Rebecca Nagel, and she teamed up with a genealogist, a real Cherokee genealogist, and they actually traced Elizabeth Warren's genealogy. And found out that she descends from a white man, William Marsh, who was in the Tennessee militia, who fought in the Cherokee Wars, who shot and killed Cherokee Indians, that he squatted apparently on Cherokee land. Decades later, his grandson, John Houston Crawford, moved his family into Indian Territory, took Cherokee land. John Crawford shot a Creek Indian for the minor offense of hitting his son Roscoe. These are all ancestors of Elizabeth Warren. Said that the Indians were mean. And then another even more extensive report explains how Jonathan Crawford, another of Warren's great-great-great-grandfathers, served in the East Tennessee Mounted Infantry Volunteer Militia. And he was involved in removing Cherokee Indians from their homes in Georgia and Tennessee and North Carolina, where they had lived for generations. So Elizabeth Warren's great-great-great-grandfather was in the militia that took these Indians, these Cherokee, out of their homes and started and moved them to Chattanooga, Tennessee, which was then just kind of a depot at the time, to start the Trail of Tears. So Elizabeth Warren's great-grandfathers were involved in taking the Cherokee out of their homeland, putting them on the Trail of Tears, shooting and killing Cherokee Indians, shooting a Creek Indian, and taking Cherokee Indian land. And by the way, her other great-great-great-grandfather also fought with Major William Lauderdale, who had reformed this battalion of Tennessee Mounted Infantry Volunteer, went down to Florida and shot and killed a bunch of Seminole Indians during the Second Seminole War. So Elizabeth Warren's ancestors were not Cherokee Indians, and instead they were white men who killed Cherokee Indians, who fought wars against them, shot and killed them, removed them from Georgia, North Carolina, and East Tennessee, and sent them on the Trail of Tears, and then squatted on, and took their land. I mean, this is a real indictment of Elizabeth Warren and her ancestors. Perhaps Elizabeth Warren should be paying reparations to the descendants of the Cherokee, who her great-great-grandfathers were involved in killing and taking their land from. Now, Elizabeth Warren didn't talk about any of the real history of her genealogy, any of the real history of her ancestry. Instead, she still runs around the country pretending that she's the descendant of Cherokee Indians, and she wants to give our taxpayer dollars, not hers, but she wants to give our taxpayer dollars to provide housing and education and health care to the members of the various Native American tribes across the country today. That is, I guess, her way of alleviating herself from the real guilt that she should feel for the horrible things that Elizabeth Warren's great-great-grandparents did to our Indian friends across the country. In any event, speaking of the never-ending question of race and ethnicity, the liberal New York Times has come out with its 1619 project. Now, this project, and I mean, it has great aspirations. Those involved in this project, they were going to really focus on the history of slavery in America and the centrality of slavery in the founding and the building of America and all of the negative consequences that result from that we are experiencing to this day. So that is the grand premise of the New York Times 1619 project. It sounds like a couple of pages from the Democratic National Committee's campaign platform. It's basically all part of the same project. Now, and I'd like to know what you think about the 1619 project. You're welcome to call in 717-540-0580 and tell me what you think. First, the project was almost exclusively contributed to by black academics, journalists, and writers. So from the beginning, no whites need apply. Whites were not permitted to be part of the 1619 Project. So from its inception, we have a little bit of racism here. All black contributors, no whites permitted. And I'll read to you some of the titles from just a few of the articles that went into this larger composition. The one title is America Wasn't a Democracy Until Black Americans Made It One. And that was an essay by Nicole Hannah-Jones. Now, Nicole Hannah-Jones, she's the creator, the originator of the 1619 Project for the New York Times. She's a reporter for the New York Times. She's not an historian, not a lawyer, not a constitutional scholar. She's a reporter for the New York Times, but yet this is her baby. This is her project. So America wasn't a democracy until black Americans made it one, the title of her essay. Now, I wonder what my listeners think about that. Is that true? Is it true that America was not a democracy until black Americans made it one? Now, one could say in response that that statement is a remarkable historical fraud, in that America, when it was created, and it was created by war, in the War for Independence, and then ultimately through the Constitution of the United States of America. Remember, that brought all of those states together and formed the United States of America through a written Constitution and a Bill of Rights. And the Constitution guarantees a Republican form of government for the United States and all of the states which comprise it. So the Republic, which is a form of democracy, was founded and put into writing, into a written guarantee in the Constitution by our founding fathers, all of whom were white. So it's a little bit of a fraud for the New York Times to suggest that America wasn't a democracy until black Americans made it one. But I'm certainly open to any caller who can point to me an historical fact to support what the New York Times is claiming. And you're welcome to call in 717-540-0580. That's 717-540-0580. Another title to another essay, American Capitalism is Brutal. You can trace that to the plantation. So it assumes that American capitalism today is a brutality, and that emanates from the plantation system. Now, I imagine most of my listeners are employed. Probably most of my listeners are employed in private companies as opposed to public government, the public or the government. So private companies in America are essentially based upon the capitalist system of the private ownership of the means of production. Is your company brutal? Is your job brutal? Now, many of you may suggest that it is. That's quite a possibility. But I imagine if you think that your job or your company is brutal, it's probably in an exaggerated sense. But anyway, this Nicole Hannah-Jones, who is the originator and the prime mover behind the New York Times 1619 Project, she wants you to think that American capitalism is brutal, and that comes from the plantation. Now, by the way, virtually none of America's great capitalists, and I'm from Pittsburgh, so I automatically think of Andrew Carnegie and Henry Clay Frick and Andrew Mellon and many others, George Westinghouse and others. America's great capitalists, none of those men were involved in plantations. None of those men were former plantation owners. Can you think? Call in and tell me what great American capitalist was a former slave owner or a former slave plantation owner. if you know of one, I'm open-minded to this New York Times 1619 project. Let me know. Call in and tell me about how America's great capitalists were descendants from slave owners, and how American capitalism comes directly from the plantation system. We're going to take a brief commercial break. When we return, we'll open up the phone lines and hear your comments. You're listening to the Marc Scaringi Show. Stay tuned.
Let's get back to the Marc Scaringi Show on News Radio WHP 580.
And welcome back to the Marc Scaringi Show, your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. We're talking today about the New York Times 1619 project to identify that America was born in slavery and racism, and the ill effects in our society today all emanates from its founding as a racist, slavery-based nation. That is the theme of the New York Times 1619 project. And we're reviewing some of the essays, the titles of the essays that comprise this project. Another is How Segregation Caused Your Traffic Jam. And so that poses an interesting question. I'm not so sure that the build-up on the getting across the Harvey Taylor Bridge in the morning, or on 83 South from York coming into Harrisburg, or at the split of 81, 83, those traffic jams there, are they caused by segregation? The New York Times believes they are. I'm interested to hear your thoughts. You're welcome to call in 717-540-0580 or comment live on one of the various Facebook pages we have running. Now, the second point I wanted to make is the originator and leader of the project is Nikole Hannah-Jones. She's a reporter from the New York Times. She proposed to have an issue of the New York Times Magazine dedicated to the re-examination of the legacy of slavery in America at the anniversary of the arrival of the first slaves to America, in order to challenge the notion that American history began in 1776. So she wants to take away the birthday of our nation. America was born in 1776, not 1619. America was born in 1776 when we declared our independence from Great Britain. But according to the New York Times and this Nikole Hannah-Jones, she claims America was born in 1619 when the Jamestown colony permitted some of its members to purchase African slaves. So the first slave ship comes into the Jamestown colony in 1619. 20 slaves disembark, and that is the beginning of slavery in Jamestown. And that, according to the New York Times, is the birth of America, that we were born with slavery. So what she's trying to do, what the Times is trying to do, is transform the American story from a nation born in freedom in 1776, when we declared our independence from Great Britain. That was a declaration of freedom and independence, that Americans were to be free and independent from a tyrannical foreign government. That's the birth of America. No, the New York Times claims that America was born in 1619 when a couple of the Jamestown settlers purchased 20 African slaves. So one of the real deleterious effects of the 1619 project, one of the real harmful effects, is that it's trying to change the birth of our nation from one born in freedom in 1776 to one born in slavery in 1619. Now, the third point is that she tells us, or the New York Times tells us, that out of slavery, in the anti-black racism is required, grew nearly everything that has truly made America exceptional. So everything that has made America exceptional came out of slavery and the anti-black racism required by the American experiment with slavery. Everything that has made America exceptional comes out of slavery. That is what the New York Times is telling us in its 1619 project. Is that true? You're welcome to call in 717-540-0580 and let me know. Now, the New York Times then lists what makes America exceptional. First, its economic might. Second, its industrial power. Third, its electoral system. Fourth, its diet. Its diet. America is exceptional because of its diet. And its diet is born out of slavery and is inherently anti-black racist. So I've never heard of that one before, but I'm willing to learn. I'm open-minded, and I'm willing to be educated by my intellectual superiors at the New York Times who believe that the American diet, our diet here in America, is what makes us exceptional, and our diet comes out of our slavery and our anti-black racism. Okay, fifth, popular music. Our popular music makes America exceptional, and our popular music comes out of slavery and our anti-black racism. I don't understand that one. I mean, that's going to take some serious education for me, because so much of our popular music comes out of the black musical experience of rhythm and blues and jazz, and so much of that is so popular and so wonderful and so great and so American. I don't really see how that comes out of slavery, but or racism. I'm not so sure how, when my white children are listening to black musicians and enjoying their music. I mean, my God, they worship Michael Jackson. How is that racist? How is the American love of black musicians racist? I don't get it. And I'm going to need some education from some of our listeners here. Then the New York Times goes on to explain other things that make America exceptional, such as the iniquities of our public health and education system. That makes us exceptional. I'm not so sure. I guess exceptional can be bad too. It can be good, but in the eyes of the New York Times, it can be bad. I guess there can be bad exceptions, and I guess America is an exception to the norm because we have an inequitable health system and education system. Now, that's strange because people from all over the world come to America for our health system and our educational system. I went to college down in Washington, D.C. at Georgetown, and we had people from all over the world, many Africans. One of our friends, one of our roommates, was some sort of prince from Zaire. He came to America for education. Many people from around the world, black and white, come to America for our public health system. I'm not so sure that our public health system is fundamentally tied into our history with slavery. I'm not really seeing that one, but again, I'm open-minded here, and I can be convinced otherwise. Let's open the phone lines, and we'll take some calls. We have Philip from Wiccanesco. Philip, you're on the Marc Scaringi Show. Yes, Philip.
I agree with you. I can't see how that makes any sense. I think what these people are trying to do is divide,
Right.
It's divide and conquer. That's their motto, divide and conquer. It's real simple. It's a divide and conquer routine. I mean, I do a lot of music myself. I sing, and I do some Michael Jackson. I do some, different ones, and it seems to be I get a lot of calls for Italian music more than I do anything else. But it's really crazy. I don't see it that way. And and we were founded in 1776. It was founded on the idea of religious freedom. Am I incorrect or correct?
I think you're correct. Yes.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Religious freedom. And it just happened to be that these are white people coming over. But then there were people in this country who were black who owned slaves. Very prominent black people who owned other black people.
Well, and about at the time of around 1619, probably 1/3 to 2/3 of the people around the world were enslaved in one form or another.
Right.
Slavery was endemic to Africa, to Asia. The African chieftains enslaved the tribesmen from the competing tribes.
Right. Yeah, that was done.
The African chieftains sold slaves to the Arabs, who used hundreds of millions of enslaved peoples throughout the history of the world. America and Americans are not exceptional or unique in that regard.
But didn't we have also people in this country who were black who owned slaves?
We certainly did. That's not a part of the 1619 Project, because the 1619 Project is designed to make white Americans have guilt for being an American.
Divide and conquer.
Yeah.
It's called divide and conquer. That's what they want to do, play the divide and conquer game.
Philip, I've got to take a brief commercial break. Thanks for calling. I appreciate the call. You're listening to the Marc Scaringi Show. Stay tuned. We'll be back right after this.
Now back to the Marc Scaringi Show on News Radio WHP 580.
And welcome back to the Marc Scaringi Show, your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. We're talking today about the New York Times 1619 Project, which puts out the premise that America was born in slavery and racism, and the problems that we confront today, from inequities in our public health and education system to our diet, to our music, and even traffic jams that we experience on the way to work, are all caused by our history of slavery and being born into and slave plantations and being a nation born into slavery, that's the premise of the New York Times article. We've talked about some of the projects, some of the articles. We've read some of the headlines and had a little bit of discussion about that. And we had a caller, Philip from Wiconisco, who reminds us that, of course, we had thousands of black Americans who were slave owners and plantation owners. That's, of course, omitted from the 1619 Project published by the New York Times. But I think more importantly is this whole premise that America was founded on slavery in 1619, when 20 African slaves were purchased by members of the Jamestown colony down there in Virginia, is of course a lie. For 100 years prior to 1619, there had been European-based slavery. Of course, Spain owned significant portions of Florida, South Carolina, and Georgia, and had slaves and slavery there. They enslaved Native Americans in those parts of eastern. Well, then it was the Spanish colony of Spain. The Portuguese and the Spanish were big slave traders. So slavery did not start with the American or the Anglo colony in Jamestown. The ship from which the slaves were purchased was a Portuguese slave ship en route to the Spanish colony of Mexico, where there was slavery. Now, that's just European-based slavery. At the time of the founding of Jamestown, in the early 1600s, slavery was legal all over the world. In fact, many Native American tribes, native to the American soil here before those English settlers got here, they all practiced some form of slavery. Native American tribes enslaved their war captives and used them for slave labor within their tribes. There were Indian tribes on the west coast of the United States, on the southeast Alaskan coast, who were slave traders. And they would come all the way down into California and other states and capture Native Americans and sell them to other Native Americans. The Pacific Northwest tribes were well known as slave traders. Nearly a quarter of their population was comprised of slaves. White settlers from England who disembarked in Jamestown in 1600 did not bring slavery to America. Slavery had been in America for thousands of years, conducted by those wonderful Indian tribes who we celebrate today. I mean, we celebrate them as if they sit at the right hand of God. Elizabeth Warren looks up to the Cherokee Nation as great peoples, but the majority of Native American tribes practiced slavery. It was a part of their culture, their society. The historian David Forsyth wrote that the fact remained that at the beginning of the 19th century, so this is almost 200 years after the 20 African slaves were brought to Jamestown, at the beginning of the 19th century, an estimated 3/4 of all people alive on planet Earth were trapped in bondage against their will in some form of slavery or serfdom. Those are hundreds of millions of people in 1800. 3/4 of the people on planet Earth were in some form of bondage in 1800. Yet the New York Times condemns America as born into racism and slavery in 1619, and that's what makes America the exception. They say the New York Times says America is exceptional because it was founded in slavery, when 3/4 of the world were enslaved 200 years after Jamestown. How does this even get published, the 1619 Project? It is such a fraud. We've had slavery since the dawn of time. Ancient Egypt, ancient China, ancient Iran, ancient Greece, ancient Rome, the Arab Islamic Caliphate, the Sultanate. They're all based on slavery. They're all slave-based cultures. The beautiful pyramids of Egypt, my God, we worship them as this amazing accomplishment of the Egyptians, built by slaves throughout the history of the world. So why is it that America is evil? Because the New York Times says we are? And how about Africa? My God, I love Africa. It's a wonderful place. But it was based upon slavery. The French historian Fernand Braudel wrote this essay about how slavery was endemic in Africa and part of the structure of everyday life forever, and still is today. Slavery came in different guises in different societies. There were court slaves, slaves incorporated in the princely armies, domestic and household slaves, slaves working on the land, in industry, as couriers, as intermediaries, and even as traders. This was in Africa. These were Africans enslaving other Africans. Anywhere from 1/3 to 2/3 of Africans were enslaved by other Africans throughout this time period. What about that? No mention of this in the 1619 Project. Throughout Africa's history, East Africa, well before the Atlantic slave trade, East Africa was the slave trading hub of the world. In Zanzibar, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of millions of Africans who were enslaved by Arab slave traders and sold throughout the Middle East, throughout Islam, throughout Southeast Asia. Millions of Africans enslaved by Arabs throughout major parts of the world. Why is this story not being told? The African slave trade that the New York Times is so focused on peaked in the late 18th century, in the late 1700s. Of course, in 1807, remember, the United States Congress banned it. It was the slave trade was made illegal by those white American founding fathers. But this African slave trade was done with the cooperation of the African tribes. It was the African tribal leaders who went through Western Africa to the various other kingdoms and enslaved the other tribesmen and then sold them to the slave traders. These were Africans capturing and enslaving other Africans and selling them to the slave traders. It was the Anglo-whites who stopped the international slave trade. It was the United Kingdom that made the slave trade illegal wherever the Royal Navy would sail. It was the Royal Navy, the English, those white Anglos, who deployed their battleships to prevent slavers from getting into the U.S., France, Spain, Portugal, Holland, West Africa, and all parts wherever the Royal Navy could sail into Arabia and Southeast Asia. Much of the international slave trade was stopped by the British, who were pretty white. If you ask me, if you ask any genealogist, England became the first country in the world to outlaw the slave trade back in 1772, followed by Scotland. How about the Republic of Vermont here in the colonies, banned slavery in its constitution in 1777. Northwest Ordinance of 1787 prohibited slaveries in the territories. America has a wonderful history of also banning slavery and banning the slave trade, which is something that is omitted from the 1619 Project. Well, there's so much more that we could say about this deplorable project by the New York Times, but that's about all the time we have today. I want to thank you for listening to the Marc Scaringi Show. Have a good weekend.